Well, welcome again all to the Heinz webinar, our regular deep dive into the wonderful, yes, wonderful world of strata and management rights in Queensland. My name's Chris Hines. I'm Director of StrataSolve, and that's stratasolve.com.au. And always, I'm joined by Frank Higginsart, partner at Heinz Legal, premier provider of legal advice to the strata industry in Queensland. Frank, how's your week been?
Right, interesting. It's funny, you sort of get to the stage of you think you've seen it all, and then the last couple of days, to be honest, I've seen some things I've never seen before in terms, and particularly one extraordinary fraudulent act of behaviour that I couldn't possibly imagine happening anywhere else but in this little place that we call Strata.
Can
It's
you give us
amazing.
key words about that, Frank?
Receipt management.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yep.
Anyway, into that one. So it's like, okay, I still learn something new every week, and that's this week's learning.
We may get back to that in a subsequent webinar. This week, it might seem odd to say this, but we're talking about the fascinating topic of apathy. Yes, it is. It is fascinating. Trust us on this one. For those listening in live via our YouTube channel, you can post your questions in the chat, and we'll endeavour to answer those as we go along. The more the merrier on that one. For those listening in later via our podcast, while you're walking the dog or washing the dishes, you can find all the notes and links that we refer to at heinzlegal.com.au. Now, Frank, this week's topic, which I have titled, I'm interested in apathy, or I'm interested in apathy, I must acknowledge a debt to that great Australian band, TISM. We'll put up a link to why I am acknowledging a debt to TISM in a moment. Of course, you can't really be interested in apathy, can you?
It's slightly oxymoronic,
yeah.
I think's the phrase, isn't it? Yep.
Yeah. But look, apathy, of course, is not confined to Strata. It happens all over the world in different forms. But of course, Frank, when it happens in Strata, it's a real problem because things literally can't get done, can they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the legislation deals with getting around it to a degree, but it still is, I think, from everyone who's involved in Strata, I suppose, in a sense, on the inside in terms of service provision, extraordinary that people can have a substantial investment, you know, relative to their net worth, or it might be their entire life savings, or it might be their home or whatever, and simply not get involved. But the problem, it has been going on. I mean, I've been doing this 30 odd years, and it has been a problem for that entire time.
Yep.
And it remains so. You know, like if you get 50% of people getting involved at a general meeting, I think you've shot the lights out in relative terms. So half the people don't care. And that's really what has always been the case. And I suppose today's topic is really what you can do about that from a range of different viewpoints, and what might trigger people to get involved.
Absolutely. What do we mean by apathy? Let's always, I think anybody who regular tuners into our podcasty webinar series will know we always like to define our terms to kick things off. So what do we mean by apathy? Well, there is no definition of apathy in Strata legislation, so we turn to good old Oxford Dictionary. The feeling of not being interested in or enthusiastic about something or things in general. Okay, fair enough. That could actually apply in a lot of cases. One of the common places we hear about apathy, Frank, in society is voter apathy, isn't it?
Yep. And I mean, I suppose, you know, we always use, you know, Australian politics as a parallel with what we're talking about in body corporate. And there's a major difference between Australian politics and body corporate politics in that both federally, state and locally, we have a compulsion. It's by law we must vote. So even if you go in and vote, and I did scrutineered once at a federal election, people did put an additional box and put Mickey Mouse and tick that number one and all that sort of stuff. Even if you want to go do that,
on it, Frank, as people often do, yeah.
Even if you go do that, you've still exercised your right to vote. You've chosen specifically not to cast one. In body corporate, there's no obligation to vote at all. So it's true that, you know, in body corporate land, Strata is run by those who show up.
It's a weird concept. We'll get a bit more to that concept in a minute. Let's just have keep going on that voter apathy theme and a bit of context. We'll put up a link to some information from the Australian Electoral Commission as well. But it looks like voter turnout in Australia is actually pretty high. We're talking about 90%, which surprised me, Frank, when I did the research on this one. It's actually been really consistent in recent years. So a lot of people would think, oh God, politics, blah, 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 yuck, yuck, yuck. You'd expect to see a big drop. It's actually remained pretty high. So the first learning, I guess, Frank, we want to share out of today, just because you are apathetic or somebody else is apathetic, doesn't mean everybody is, does it?
No, absolutely not. And it's sort of that voting number did surprise me, like 90%. Like I think it's 10% of people not bothering, and I suppose risking the fines is quite interesting. But that to me also says generationally, people. So if we go, boomers, X, Y, millennials, I suppose our Y generation really hasn't hit the polling booths yet, but it shows that there's a consistency of, I suppose, engagement from a voting perspective. And in Strata, we've got that same thing, except it's probably a broader church in the sense of probably something to where you get with first homeowner grants and all that sort of stuff. There's a group of younger people that own, they're not necessarily in houses anymore because that might be unaffordable. They're in Strata and they're in bodies corporate. So what's that going to look like from a Strata perspective? It's really interesting. That's, I suppose, the technology piece with engagement and all the rest of it. So, yeah.
Yeah. As we said, as you quite rightly pointed out, Frank, when it comes to Strata in particular, apathy manifests itself in the fact that there's no compulsion to vote. I mean, really the only mandatory things, well, not the only, but the biggest mandatory things in Strata are you're a member of the body corporate if you're an owner, so that's number one, and you pay your levies, number two. And then there's also, I guess, maintain your loss as well, Frank?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And
comply with some laws?
Yeah, bylaws are compulsory. Yeah, mate, and I suppose the rest of it is then frameworks around decision making almost, isn't it? So if you don't choose to engage and other people are going to make decisions for you, then here's the rules. You've got to pay the costs of those decisions, whatever they might be, which is your levies.
Yeah. So really, once you get past all those mandated obligations in Strata, you can pretty much do as you please. And people do, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be. Let's take a look at it from the different segments in Strata, Frank. And when it comes to owners, apathy, I think, is really strongly felt. The obvious one there is that people don't vote, but there's a whole bunch of other ways apathy manifests itself, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. They're not returning voting papers. They mightn't appoint, if you owned it in some sort of corporate entity, you mightn't even bother appointing a corporate nominee, which means you don't have the right to vote or even attend, not engaging in committee participation, not reading meeting minutes, and then usually Chris complaining about the outcomes of whatever manifests itself from those committee decisions 6 months later, and perhaps even ignoring body corporate requests. I mean, another one we've had this week is the QBCC cladding type thing where the committee was dealing with it itself and just decided to go radio silence. So ignored the QBCC. So again, we're talking about owners here, but in terms of, this is too hard, I couldn't be bothered. And that probably isn't going to lead to a good outcome. But yeah, it's just ignoring, it's just complete disengagement, I suppose, would be the easiest thing to say from an owner's perspective. I've got other things in my life. I'm not bothering with that body corporate stuff.
Even if it happens to be stuff which ultimately is in their benefit, it might be that works are being proposed or planned, which would actually benefit the lot owner in the long run, just not responding to the request from the committee. That's apathy. When it comes to the committee, you just touched upon one there, Frank, and I think that's a big one. Committees not deciding, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah, the head in the sand approach. And I get it. I suppose you get it too, Mark. Like it's sort of you're volunteering to do this. It distracts you from whatever you might want to do in your day-to-day life, but with power comes responsibility. I think that's probably not quite the Spider-Man quote you'd normally use, but there you go. But yeah, it's ignoring what needs to be done, because as a committee member, you've actually got obligations to sort of run the body corporate with the support of your body corporate manager and your other committee members. But yeah, ignoring things is usually not the go, but it happens.
That's right. And then related to that, procrastinating on decisions. Some legislation's recently changed to try and tighten that aspect up, but committees can and still do procrastinate. A fear of making decisions, I think, would be a bit of a manifestation of apathy on a committee, and also not communicating within the committee appropriately. For caretakers then, Frank, it's a slightly different one, although similar kinds of things, isn't it, when it comes
It
to best
is, and I
operation?
suppose, caretakers and letting agents formally engaged by the body corporate, they've got obligations under their contract to do or not do certain things. So it's not quite voluntary in the sense of like owners or owners' engagements with their body corporate. But apathy in an on-site management context is absolutely not doing the job. There's usually a schedule of duties. You're required to do X, Y, and Z. I couldn't be bothered with that one today. Pool doesn't need cleaning today. It's clean enough, whatever it might be. Maybe, and when particularly, I suppose, things start to go downhill in terms of relationships, it's sort of ignoring emails, not responding to requests, and really not engaging with committees or even letting owners in that sense when they're required to. It's sort of you can almost retreat. And I suppose this is a business thing as opposed to a ownership thing. When things get too hard, you can't see the forest for the trees. It's really easy at times just to sort of retreat into your shell and block out all the noise. That might appear as apathetic to external third parties. It might be a mental health issue on the other side, but either way, it's still not doing what you need to do in terms of keeping the business of the body corporate running, because an on-site manager or a caretaker or letting agent has a relatively big role in that.
And just to agree, Frank, it just occurs to me that we're talking about non-response as a sign of apathy. I actually think the flip side could also be a sign of apathy where your response is 10 pages worth of a thesis on the scenario. To me, that suggests somebody who is apathetic, but they're actually expressing their apathy in a way which makes engagement just about impossible.
And maybe even being glib. Even being glib in terms of a response. Hey, we've got an issue. This is what we think we need to do. Blah, 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 blah. What do you think about that? Yes. Like, that's not real helpful. It's a response, but it's a very apathetic response. So I suppose it's you can read that any number of ways, can't you? The big, long, verbose one, the short one, the ignoring one, but they're all manifestations of a form of apathy, not being interested in what's going on.
When it comes to strata managers, apathy also manifests itself. I suspect this is a slightly different kettle of fish, this one. When if strata managers are experiencing or feeling apathetic, I think it's probably a byproduct of some pretty negative interactions that have occurred over a period of time. And that's the obvious things such as not responding to emails or phone calls, giving incomplete responses. A big one for me, Frank, I think when this is probably the bit of apathy, but it's also a sign that there's a little bit of absorbed trauma on the part of the strata managers when they start labeling clients. That tells me that they've moved beyond the objective and have gone into the subjective.
Absolutely. And I think, like I suppose the big difference for strata managers as opposed to the other categories of strata occupier we've spoken about in terms of owners, committees and on-site managers is strata managers usually don't have one body corporate. They might have 50 or 60. So it's very easy, subject to what's going on in their lives, to get the problem body corporate or the problem children in a body corporate out onto a limb and ignore them. And that's probably just as much a function of how their workplace is managed as it is their personal attributes at that particular point in time, because it can get very intense inside strata management land.
Yeah, really, it can. Some early warning signs of strata apathy then. So we talked about how it manifests itself. How do you identify it? We've touched upon that, but just a few little things which, if they're popping up in your strata, might be a sign of some strata apathy and urge you to take a bit of action, which we'll get to. So it's things such as outstanding levies, poor turnouts for meetings, never achieving a quorum. This is a big one. The same people running for the same positions every time.
Yep.
A really good one, Frank, would be a lot of return to sender notices.
Yeah, and that's probably going to manifest itself in outstanding levies as well, because people aren't getting the invoices. But even then, they're not bothering to engage with their body corporate to change their address so they can know what's going on.
Yep. I think increasing delays in responding, so, and particularly if the responses from somebody used to be quite timely, and then they start to change and you either don't get one at all, or it's really short, or it takes a long time, and just a lack of information or a lack of transparency. Those are usually signs that apathy is finding its way into your strata scheme. Well, On the theme then, Frank, of apathy, why do I care? Who cares? It's just, yeah. Why should one care about Strata apathy, Frank?
Well, it's going to increase the risk of your involvement in your body corporate. It's potentially going to increase the costs, and it's potentially going to increase the liabilities. So if you go to, again, that example of the chairperson just before who's just put his hands in the air and decided to ignore what needed to be done and ignoring emails from regulatory authorities, the reason we're now involved is because that regulatory authority's got rather stroppy. So, there is a consequence of apathetic behaviour that is going to lead to increased costs for that body corporate. And it's the same thing, even adjourned meetings, like there's a cost with, so just for those that might not be intimately familiar with it, the default position, which can change under the new modules, is to have a general meeting, 2 people present in person and 25% of persons or voters having cast votes. So it's only a quarter of the building, or a quarter of the voters to have exercised the right to say yes or no to their agenda, whatever it might be. So if you don't get that, 75% of people, 75% of voters haven't cared enough. And meeting holds over same time next week, but there's a cost for everyone to roll back around and and do what needs to be done from a body corporate perspective. And I suppose, Chris, you go to the end game with that. At that second adjourned meeting, the votes that are on the floor on the day are what counted regardless of how many they are. And I have dead set seen meetings with, biggest one I think was about 130 lots. There was 1 vote cast for the adjourned meeting. So that one person controlled everything that happened on that body corporate agenda. And what happens if they're crazy or unhinged or uninvolved or uninterested? What decisions are they making on behalf of everyone else? So that's a consequence of simply not engaging in the affairs of your body corporate.
It's really well articulated and sort of well described, Frank, how things can actually pan out. And as you say, it's not necessarily a one-off. That actually happens a fair bit. Other end results of Strata apathy, decisions not being made, which can be pretty critical in the end. Underperforming sinking funds, so sinking funds that just aren't there, aren't what they should be, which in turn means more financial pressure on owners ultimately. Lack of maintenance and improvements, that's pretty obvious. It relates back to lack of decisions, I suppose. Suspicion and wariness, I think, is a big one. When people start to think that everybody is out to get them, or that people in Strata are out to get them. And I think the key words there, Frank, are things like blocks and collusion. I saw one somewhere where somebody complained about the committee has a fan club. Well, of course they have a fan club. They're called supporters. That's just how it is. So once that starts to happen, that's a product of apathy, disregard for bylaws.
Yep, the rules of community living get ignored. I suppose committees. You might be trying to run on a committee of 2, which in a sense is unlawful. You see that from time to time because there's only 2 people that bother to get involved. Insurance, particularly, I suppose, the further north you go. I mean, this is a really difficult space for Strata at the moment in terms of North Queensland insurance, and people need to be watching what's going on with their buildings. And that's not to say that anyone's doing the wrong thing, but it's a very interesting market with lots of moving parts. North Queensland insurance scheme, if no one's taking an interest in what's going on from an insurance perspective, who knows where the body corporate's going to ultimately finish?
And look, Frank, I've had 2 recent examples of the extremes of that when it comes to apathy. In one building, it was just one owner who cared that their building's insurance, this was in not so much far North Queensland, but northish Queensland, cared that the insurance was about to expire and went through an extraordinary process to find someone eventually who was willing to insure the building. And at the other end of that, when I sort of have conferences with clients, I always ask the question about insurance: is it up to date? Now, even if the issue that they want to talk about has nothing at all to do with insurance, I always ask, because that tells me if there's a problem at that scheme or not. And it's remarkable, Frank, the number of times people go, "Oh, I think." That's bad news. When that happens, you can't think that your insurance is up to date.
You'd like to know, wouldn't you? Ideally.
And then probably worst case scenario for apathy, the the scheme falls into dysfunction, and then that means either a Part 5 agreement or an administration, which is all of the power is taken away from the voters. And you might say, well, that's okay because they're not doing anything anyway. I can guarantee you that once it starts, it will be a different story, and it costs a whole lot of money. Administrators aren't cheap, Frank, are they?
No. So yeah, you lose control, and you pay the price for losing control physically in terms of money out of your pocket.
Absolutely. All right, so we've gone on about that at some length. So what can be done about it? So, I mean, and this is a tricky one, isn't it, Frank? Because once apathy takes hold, it's really hard.
It is. And I think, mate, yeah, ultimately, if it's there and it's endemic, it's got to start somewhere. And the unfortunate reality is that you need to go get a mirror and have a good hard look in it, because it probably starts with you.
Yep.
If you want to, as an owner or as a potential committee member, even as an on-site manager, Strata manager is probably a little bit harder, but for it's a separate issue again in terms of workplace and the rest of it. But at its core, getting a body corporate back to the stage where it's not apathetic requires someone to drive a change in behaviour. And it's apathy starts, for me at least, in a large part with expecting other people to do the heavy lifting.
Yep.
If you expect other people to do the heavy lifting and they don't, then you're all sitting around looking at each other waiting for someone to do it. And if no one does it, then you're back exactly where you are today. If you want to make change, you've got to make change, because if nothing changes, nothing changes. So it requires some effort.
Yep.
Is the starting point, isn't it?
Yeah, and look, there'd be a lot of people out there who would go, yes, I know all of that, but why does it have to be me? It's unfair. I always have to do this. Yeah, it is. It's really unfair. But I think we have articulated what your options are if you don't. Someone has to do it.
If you want change.
Yep.
Otherwise, status quo is a legitimate choice.
Always.
Doing nothing and remain in the exact same place is a legitimate choice. And if you choose to do that, and I suppose this is the battle that you and I have, mate, when people come to us complaining about things but have never done anything to change it. It's sort of it's not to say to clients, this is what your choice is, but you must make it, because no one else is likely to. And they might band together with a couple of people. Righto, let's sort this out. What are we going to do? Little sort of subcommittee that isn't a formal committee. How are we going to get people knowing what's going on?
And sometimes, Frank, it takes a few false starts as well.
Yep.
You might try a couple of times and get nowhere, and that puts you off. I'm not going to try anymore. Well, keep going. You would be surprised, actually, how you can do that. And as you said, Frank, the place to start is informally. So get a copy of the role, or if it exists, and if it doesn't, do your best to sort of try and get a working copy of the role up to date. And then just start communicating. You start talking, you start emailing, you think about your message in particular. So if you're trying to get other people on board with you, think about the message, try and focus it on hip pocket issues, property values. And so this is about your property value and the value of your investment. Try and make that as positive and constructive a thing as you could possibly do under the circumstances. I think, Frank, following on from that, set the example. You want to remove apathy? Okay, make sure you return your voting papers. Make sure you read the materials. Make sure you put your hand up to do something, like be on the committee.
Yep, and like for me, one of the default positions is, the body corporate managers and the legislation says what it says, and what it says will happen. Agendas will go out in accordance with the format of all of the usual Strata software players. It will say all the things it needs to say, blah, blah, blah. But there's no reason that an owner, a committee member, or someone interested can't do a short page cover letter at the top. Say, hey, AGM's coming. Here's the motions. Here's what they mean.
Yep.
This is what the committee thinks you should do. Like, a one-pager that makes it really simple for people to digest is probably going to get people more engaged than having to wade through something that's online or a 20-page document which they don't necessarily understand. So what is this thing? Why do we have it? Like, I mean, even that's a good start, because you don't learn that at school. You don't learn it at university or at your job or whatever it might be. It's just thrust upon you when you buy into one of these body corporate schemes. So educating people about what it is that they've actually bought into, I think, is a big part of it as well.
Yep. Seek qualified advice to assist you. If it is a bit insurmountable, there are people who can provide qualified advice that can go some or even all of the way getting back on things. If you're personally struggling for motivation, I think it always comes back to hip pocket. You're involved in Strata in some way because of a financial investment. So harsh, but keep focusing on that hip pocket issue. Just a few more things. Try and contextualize things and be a bit realistic about it. You might be sitting there thinking body corporate stuff is too hard. Well, yeah, except that there is so much free information out there. Every Strata law firm, every Strata consultancy has a bunch of content that can assist you. And there is this amazing thing called the Commissioner's Office, which can also help you out. And really, when you think about it, the amount of effort you'll have to make if you're an owner, it's really only a few hours a week, really. It's not that terrible in most situations. And I guess, Frank, if things are really too taxing for you, get somebody to look after your interests.
Yep. Absolutely. And that might not necessarily be someone you pay. It might be a family member who's interested or a friend who's got some experience or wants to get involved just for the sport of it, you know?
Yep.
Yeah, and even, you know, the getting to know how Strata works. It's like sort of every journey starts with but a single step. There's a lot of information there. And I mean, we've got 100 hours worth of webinars sitting on our website now. So, you know, you don't need to take all that in at the one time. Just chip away at it.
Yep. When we talk about caretakers, it's about recognising some of those warning signs that we spoke about before. And remember, this is your profession. After all, you've invested an awful lot of money in this. Start talking with some of your peers and colleagues, professional bodies. Take a time out if you can, or talk to your boss if you can. Maybe you take upon a different role sometimes, or look to sort of transfer responsibility for particular schemes. I know that happens in Strata management firms sometimes, Frank. So that makes a lot of sense doing that if you can. For when it comes to committees, and this assumes that you actually have one, but if committee you're a bit apathetic, just make a decision. You have to do it. You will not be tarred and feathered. There will be consequences for the decision, but so long as it's been made properly and with a bit of thought and process behind it, do it.
And share the load. Yeah, share the load. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There are places, people, and options out there to help you. And look, for everyone, I guess the final point that we make is if apathy really takes hold, there are options available to you under legislation to do something. Most of those, though, Frank, aren't they, are for when things have gotten mission critical.
Yeah, it's like something's going horribly wrong. So there's, you know, mechanisms to address those wrongs through the Commissioner's Office with orders or otherwise. And really, I suppose what we're talking about today is trying to get involved before those things become necessary. So what's you know, what do you have to do to change things? And I suppose that does come back to you got to get involved.
Yep.
If you don't get involved, then it's a bit hard to criticise other people for not doing it.
And probably what we haven't really talked about today, Frank, is what some of the left field options might be. So should Strata participation be compulsory? How do you make it compulsory? Would that even work anyway? What about paid professional committees, for example?
That might be a future conversation point, Christopher.
Yeah, good point. What about the idea, in the same way that you have professional board members, what about professional committee members?
Executive and non-executive, absolutely. And particularly when you go to bigger bodies corporate, and even bigger, I'd say more complicated because size isn't necessarily the be all and end all. There's some complicated things that can come up, even from a corporate governance perspective. And I suppose in the land of the volunteer, it can be the blind leading the blind at times. So yeah, mate, I again, comes at a cost, but it also comes at a form of insurance, in effect of getting some proper transparent and correct corporate governance / decision-making processes might not be a bad thing in some bodies corporate.
Absolutely, Frank. And look, there are a couple of other things there to consider. Would they making training for committee members and owners, for that matter, compulsory? Maybe that's an option. Look, we have reached the end for today. Don't forget to sort of hit the notify and like buttons on YouTube and Facebook so that you get reminders about being involved with the Heinz webinar every week. We'll be back same time, same bat channel next week. Frank Higginson, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, as always, and thank you everyone for listening in.
I'm Chris Owens from Strata Style, Frank Higginson from Heinz Legal. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Done. Bye all.